In a quiet, crumbling farmhouse on the edge of a forgotten town, Elias Morales sat by the window, staring at the relentless rain. Decades had passed since his brother Julian had vanished. His body never found, his fate whispered in shadows. But today, amidst the usual bills and junk mail, a peculiar envelope arrived. The handwriting on it was unmistakable. Julian's. As Elias tore it open with trembling hands, his breath caught. The letter wasn't just familiar, it was written in his own handwriting. Elias Morales had lived a life of predictable solitude. His days were measured by the steady creak of his rocking chair and the methodical ticking of the grandfather clock that had outlived his parents. For decades, his world was small, limited to the crumbling walls of his farmhouse and the memories of a life he barely understood anymore. But even in the monotony of his days, one name haunted him like a distant echo. Julian. Julian had been more than a brother. He was a mirror, a partner in crime, the light to Elias's shadow. But the bond that had once seemed unbreakable had been severed in the most tragic way imaginable. Julian had disappeared one stormy night 50 years ago, swallowed by the thick woods behind their childhood home. No body was ever found. No answers ever came. And over the years, the whispers of neighbors had only fueled the fire of Elias's guilt. Some said Julian had run away. Others speculated something darker. A fight, an accident, a terrible secret buried in the woods. Elias never spoke of it. He couldn't. The weight of Julian's absence was too heavy, his own memories of that night too fractured. All he knew was that Julian was gone, and the emptiness left behind had consumed him. The letter arrived on an otherwise unremarkable afternoon. The rain pattered softly against the windows as Elias sorted through his mail. Bills, advertisements, a catalog he would never order from. And then there it was, an envelope that felt out of place. Its edges were worn, as though it had been handled too many times, and the ink on the front had bled slightly from moisture. Elias's name was written in a hand that stopped him cold, his brother's handwriting, or at least what he remembered of it. His heart pounded as he turned the envelope over in his hands, half expecting it to vanish like a cruel trick of his imagination. But it was real. He could feel the rough texture of the paper, smell the faint mustiness that clung to it. With trembling fingers, he opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper, yellowed with age, and the words scrawled upon it were both familiar and foreign. Dear Elias, if you're reading this, it means you haven't forgotten. You haven't forgotten me, haven't forgotten the truth of what happened that night. I know you've tried to bury it, to pretend it wasn't your fault. But deep down, you know. You always knew, and now it's time to face it. Come find me where the light never reaches. Julian. The room spun. Elias's breath came in shallow gasps as he read and reread the letter. The handwriting was identical to his brother's, every loop and curve a perfect match. But it wasn't just that. There was something else, something he couldn't ignore. The writing, it was also his. The way the words flowed, the pressure on the pen, it mirrored his own. Elias dropped the letter as though it burned him. His hands trembled uncontrollably, and his mind raced with 1,000 questions. How could this be? How could Julian have written this? And why did it look like he had written it himself? He stumbled to his chair and collapsed into it, the letter lying on the floor like an accusation. Memories of that night flooded back with a vengeance. The argument, the storm, the way Julian had looked at him, betrayal etched into his features. And then, nothing. Just darkness. For years, Elias had tried to piece together the fragments of that night, but they never fit. Now, the letter had torn open old wounds and unearthed questions he had buried long ago. The words, where the light never reaches, echoed in his mind, a cryptic riddle that felt both familiar and menacing. Elias forced himself to stand, his legs unsteady beneath him. He picked up the letter again, examining it as though it might reveal more if he looked closely enough. But there was nothing else, just the haunting words and the undeniable truth that they were written in his brother's hand, or perhaps his own. He spent the rest of the day pacing the house, the letter never far from his mind. The rain outside grew heavier, the sound of it like whispers against the glass. By evening, Elias found himself standing by the window, staring out at the woods that loomed in the distance. They were the same woods where Julian had vanished all those years ago. The letter's words played on a loop in his mind, urging him, taunting him. Where the light never reaches. What did it mean? Was it a place? A memory? Or something far more sinister? As night fell, Elias made a decision. He couldn't ignore the letter. Whether it was a cruel joke or something far stranger, he had to know the truth. Grabbing a flashlight and his old coat, he stepped out into the rain, the letter tucked safely in his pocket. The woods awaited him, their shadows stretching out like long, grasping fingers. Elias knew one thing as he trudged toward the trees. His life would never be the same. Whatever awaited him in the darkness, it would either bring him closure or destroy him entirely. The woods loomed before Elias like a black ocean, its depths impenetrable under the shroud of night. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, but the damp air clung to his skin like a cold, unwelcome embrace. With each hesitant step, the beam of his flashlight carved fleeting tunnels of light through the trees, only to have the darkness swallow them whole the moment they moved on. He hadn't been to these woods in decades, not since the night Julian had vanished. Even now, the memory of it made his stomach churn. He could still feel the icy wind of that stormy night, hear the crack of thunder that had seemed to shake the earth itself, and the look in Julian's eyes, anger, hurt, betrayal, burned into his mind like a brand. What had they argued about? The details were murky, obscured by time and the fog of his own guilt. But one thing was clear. Elias had been the last person to see him. The letter in his pocket felt heavier than paper should, as though it carried not just words but the weight of the past itself. Where the light never reaches. The phrase repeated in his mind like a chant, pulling him deeper into the forest. The flashlight flickered, its beam faltering, and Elias cursed under his breath. He smacked the device against his palm and the light steadied, but the momentary darkness had rattled him. Every shadow seemed to shift, every rustle of leaves a whisper of something unseen. He forced himself to keep moving, the soft crunch of wet leaves underfoot the only sound in the suffocating silence. The woods felt alive in a way that was both mesmerizing and terrifying, as though the trees were ancient sentinels, watching his every move. And then he saw it, a faint glow in the distance, barely visible through the dense undergrowth. Elias hesitated. The glow was unnatural, a pale, otherworldly light that didn't belong in the middle of these woods. His instincts screamed at him to turn back, to leave whatever this was alone. But the letter's words pushed him forward, his feet moving almost of their own accord. As he drew closer, the glow resolved into a small clearing bathed in an eerie, silvery light. At its center stood an old, gnarled tree, its twisted branches reaching skyward like skeletal arms. Something about the tree felt wrong, as though it didn't belong to this world. Its bark was as black as coal, its surface glistening as though it were wet. And at its base was something that made Elias's blood run cold. A single lantern, flickering with the same ghostly light that had drawn him here. Next to it, half buried in the roots of the tree, was a box. It was small, made of aged wood and bound with rusted metal. Elias approached it cautiously, every nerve in his body on edge. The closer he got, the more he felt an almost physical pressure, as though the air around the tree was heavier, thicker. He knelt before the box, his hands trembling as he reached for it. The moment his fingers touched the wood, a jolt shot through him, sharp and electric, like a static shock magnified 100-fold. He gasped, pulling his hand back, but the pull of the box was irresistible. Taking a deep breath, he gripped it again, this time lifting it from the tangled roots. The box was surprisingly light, its surface cold to the touch. Elias placed it on the ground and examined it more closely. There was no lock, just a simple latch that seemed almost too inviting. He hesitated, a deep sense of foreboding washing over him. But the letter's words echoed in his mind, and he knew he couldn't turn back now. With a trembling hand, he lifted the latch and opened the box. Inside was a collection of items that made his heart stop. A rusted pocket watch he recognized immediately as Julian's. A photograph of the two of them as children, its edges worn and yellowed with age, and a small, folded piece of paper. Elias's hands shook as he unfolded it, his eyes scanning the words written in the same hauntingly familiar handwriting as the letter. "You're close, Elias. So close. But the truth isn't here. It's deeper, hidden where even the light cannot find it. You must go further. Follow the path." Beneath the words was a crude map, drawn in faint lines that seemed to shift and waver as he looked at them. It showed the clearing he was in, marked by the strange tree, and a winding path that led deeper into the woods. At the end of the path was an X marked with a single word, home. Elias sat back on his heels, his mind spinning. Home? What could it mean? He had lived in the same farmhouse his entire life. How could home be somewhere out here, in the middle of these dark, alien woods? The questions were endless, but the answers were just out of reach, tantalizing and maddening. The lantern's light flickered, and for a moment Elias thought he saw a shadow move across the clearing. He froze, his breath catching in his throat. The shadow was gone as quickly as it had appeared, but the sense of being watched was overwhelming. He stuffed the paper and the pocket watch back into the box, tucking the photograph carefully into his coat pocket. Then, clutching the map, he rose to his feet. The path ahead was faint, barely more than a trail of disturbed earth winding between the trees. It called to him, pulling him forward despite the fear that gripped his heart. The map trembled in his hands, the crude lines seeming to guide him even as they remained still on the page. As he took his first steps onto the path, Elias glanced back at the tree. The lantern flickered again, its light dimming, and for a moment he thought he saw a figure standing among the roots, a man with sunken eyes and a crooked smile. Elias blinked, and the figure was gone, leaving only the oppressive silence of the woods. The path stretched out before him, disappearing into the darkness. Whatever lay at the end of it, Elias knew he couldn't turn back. The truth, whatever it was, awaited him where the light never reached. Elias moved deeper into the woods, the path narrowing with every step. The trees grew denser, their twisted branches reaching toward him like skeletal fingers. The air was heavier here, damp and filled with an earthy scent that clung to his senses. The flashlight's beam flickered again, but this time, Elias didn't stop to fix it. He gripped the map tightly in one hand, his other clutching the flashlight, as if the feeble light was his only tether to reality. The further he walked, the more distorted the woods seemed to become. The shapes of the trees blurred at the edges, their trunks bending at impossible angles. Shadows moved where there was no light, and whispers, soft, barely audible, drifted through the air. At first, Elias thought they were tricks of his mind, echoes of his own thoughts amplified by the suffocating silence. But as the whispers grew louder, forming fragmented words, he realized they weren't coming from him. "Elias?" The voice was faint but unmistakable. It carried Julian's tone, a mixture of familiarity and accusation. Elias froze in place, his heart pounding. "Come closer." He turned, shining the flashlight into the darkness, but saw nothing. The voice was coming from everywhere and nowhere, wrapping around him like an unseen force. Panic clawed at him, but he forced himself to keep moving. The map led him onward, deeper into a part of the woods he didn't recognize. These weren't the trees of his childhood. They were ancient, gnarled, and otherworldly. The path took a sharp turn, leading to a clearing unlike any Elias had ever seen. The ground was bare, the soil dark and wet as though freshly dug. At the center of the clearing stood an old mirror, its frame ornate and covered in ivy. The glass was cracked, reflecting distorted fragments of the forest around it. As Elias approached, he saw his reflection, a tired, hollow man with sunken eyes and trembling hands. But as he stepped closer, the reflection changed. The man in the mirror was no longer Elias. It was Julian, or something that looked like him. His face was gaunt, his eyes sunken and void of life, and his lips curled into a twisted smile. "You've come so far," the reflection spoke, the voice echoing in the clearing. "But you're not ready for the truth, are you?" Elias stumbled back, nearly dropping the flashlight. "This isn't real," he whispered, his voice trembling. "You're not real." The reflection laughed, a hollow, haunting sound that sent shivers down Elias's spine. "You've spent 50 years convincing yourself of that, 50 years running from the truth, but you can't run anymore. It's time to remember." "Remember what?" Elias demanded, his voice rising in desperation. "What happened that night? What did I do?" The reflection tilted its head, its smile fading. "You already know. You've always known. But the truth is buried, just like me." Before Elias could respond, the reflection shattered. The sound of breaking glass filled the air, and Elias shielded his face as shards flew toward him. When he opened his eyes, the mirror was gone, replaced by an open grave. The edges of the pit were jagged, the soil disturbed as though something, or someone, had clawed its way out. Elias's breath came in shallow gasps as he approached the edge of the grave. The pit was deep, its bottom shrouded in darkness. But as he stared into it, he saw something move, something pale and skeletal, its movements slow and deliberate. Panic surged through him, and he staggered back, nearly losing his footing. "Don't run," the voice echoed again, softer this time. "You have to finish this." The map in his hand began to change, the ink shifting and swirling on the page. The path extended further, leading away from the clearing and toward a large, dark structure that loomed in the distance. Elias didn't recognize it, but the word beneath the map's X was now clearer than ever: home. Gathering what little courage he had left, Elias followed the new path. The woods grew darker, the air colder, and the whispers more insistent. They surrounded him, overlapping and echoing, a cacophony of voices all speaking his name. "Elias, Elias, Elias." He pressed on, his legs heavy and his mind racing. The path led him to a clearing where the trees formed a perfect circle. At the center stood the structure from the map, a decrepit house, its walls sagging and its roof caved in. The windows were dark, their glass shattered, and the front door hung ajar. Elias hesitated at the edge of the clearing, his instincts screaming at him to turn back. But the pull of the house was undeniable. It was as if the letter, the map, and the whispers had all conspired to bring him here. Taking a deep breath, he stepped forward, the weight of the past pressing down on him with every step. The door creaked loudly as he pushed it open, the sound echoing through the empty halls. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of decay, and the floorboards groaned under his weight. The house was eerily familiar, its layout mirroring the farmhouse he had lived in his entire life. But everything was wrong. The walls were covered in black mold, the furniture was overturned and broken, and the mirrors, there were mirrors everywhere, each one cracked and distorted. As Elias ventured further into the house, he felt a strange sense of déjà vu. He reached the living room, where a single chair sat upright, facing away from him. The air was colder here, and the whispers had stopped, replaced by a suffocating silence. Elias approached the chair cautiously, his flashlight trembling in his hand. When he rounded the chair, he stopped dead in his tracks. Sitting in the chair was Julian, or what was left of him. His body was skeletal, his skin pale and stretched tightly over his bones. His eyes were dark hollows, and his lips moved as though he were trying to speak. "Elias." The voice was faint, barely more than a breath. "You've found me." Elias fell to his knees, tears streaming down his face. "Julian, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean for this to happen. I don't even remember." Julian's skeletal hand reached out, brushing against Elias's cheek. "You will," he whispered. "You'll remember everything." Before Elias could respond, the house began to shake. The walls groaned, the mirrors shattered, and the floor beneath him cracked open. Elias screamed as he fell into the darkness, Julian's voice echoing around him. "You can't escape the truth, Elias. Not anymore." Elias woke with a start, his body sprawled across the cold, damp ground. The darkness was absolute, suffocating, and for a moment he wasn't sure if he had gone blind. His flashlight was nowhere to be found, and the map had slipped from his grasp. His heart raced as he pushed himself up, his hands sinking into the damp soil beneath him. The last thing he remembered was Julian's skeletal hand brushing his cheek, the house trembling, and the floor giving way beneath him. Now, he was somewhere else, a place that felt more like a void than a physical space. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the faint sound of dripping water somewhere in the distance. "Julian!" Elias's voice cracked as he called out. The name echoed into the void, but there was no response. He stumbled forward, his arms outstretched, searching for anything solid to anchor himself to. The ground beneath his feet felt uneven, shifting slightly with every step, as though it were alive. As his eyes adjusted to the darkness, faint shapes began to materialize around him. He saw jagged rocks jutting out of the ground, their surfaces slick and glistening. In the distance, a faint, sickly green glow illuminated what appeared to be a path. The glow pulsed rhythmically like the heartbeat of some unseen creature, and despite the fear gnawing at his insides, Elias felt compelled to follow it. The path wound through a labyrinth of towering stone formations, their surfaces carved with strange symbols that seemed to shift and writhe when Elias looked directly at them. The whispers returned, soft at first but growing louder with each step. They weren't the same as before. These voices were fragmented, broken, as though whoever was speaking was trapped in an endless loop of agony. "Elias!" The voice was clearer now, and it sent a chill down his spine. "You're almost there." "Where are you?" Elias demanded, his voice trembling. "What is this place?" But the voices didn't answer. They only repeated the same haunting words. "Almost there. Almost there." The path eventually led Elias to a massive cavern, its walls covered in a thick black substance that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. At the center of the cavern was a pool of water, its surface eerily still despite the dripping sound that echoed through the chamber. The sickly green glow emanated from the pool, casting distorted shadows across the cavern walls. Elias approached the pool cautiously, his heart pounding. He knelt at its edge, staring into its depths. The water was impossibly clear, and for a moment, Elias thought he saw his own reflection staring back at him. But as he leaned closer, the reflection changed. It wasn't him. It was Julian. Julian's face stared up at him from the water, his eyes hollow and his expression one of despair. "Elias!" The voice came not from the water, but from the air around him. "You left me here." "No," Elias whispered, shaking his head. "I didn't. I don't remember." "You don't want to remember," Julian's voice accused, "but you will." The water began to ripple, and before Elias could react, a hand shot up from the pool, its bony fingers wrapping around his wrist. Elias screamed as he was pulled forward, the cold water engulfing him. He struggled against the grip, but it was unrelenting, dragging him deeper into the pool's icy depths. Darkness surrounded him, and for a moment, Elias thought he was going to drown. But then the grip released him, and he found himself standing, not underwater, but in a strange, otherworldly landscape. The sky above was a swirling mass of black and green, and the ground beneath his feet was cracked and barren. Ahead of him stood a figure, its back turned to him. Elias recognized the shape immediately. Julian. The figure turned slowly, and Elias's breath caught in his throat. It was Julian, but not as he remembered him. His skin was pale and translucent, his eyes glowing with an unnatural light. He smiled, but it wasn't a smile of joy. It was twisted, sinister. "You found me," Julian said, his voice echoing unnaturally. "After all this time." "Julian." Elias took a hesitant step forward. "I don't understand. What is this place? What happened to you?" "You happened to me," Julian replied, his smile fading. "You don't remember because you don't want to. But it's time to face the truth." The ground beneath them began to shake, and the sky above darkened further. Julian raised a hand, and the symbols Elias had seen carved into the stones earlier began to glow, their light growing brighter and more intense. "What truth?" Elias demanded, his voice rising in desperation. "I've spent my whole life trying to remember, trying to understand. Just tell me." Julian's glowing eyes locked onto Elias's. "The night I disappeared, you and I argued. You were angry, angrier than I'd ever seen you. I tried to leave, but you wouldn't let me." Elias shook his head violently, tears streaming down his face. "No, that's not true. I wouldn't." "You pushed me," Julian said, his voice cold and unwavering. "You pushed me, and I fell. Do you remember now? Do you remember what you did?" The memories hit Elias like a tidal wave. The argument, the storm, the look of betrayal on Julian's face as Elias shoved him, the sickening thud as Julian's body hit the rocks below, and the fear so overwhelming that Elias had convinced himself it wasn't real, that it hadn't happened. "No!" Elias screamed, falling to his knees. "It wasn't my fault. It was an accident." Julian knelt before him, his expression unreadable. "You've spent 50 years running from the truth, Elias, but you can't run anymore. This is where it ends." The ground beneath Elias began to crack, and he felt himself sinking. Julian stood, his glowing eyes the last thing Elias saw before the darkness consumed him. Elias's descent felt endless. The darkness around him was thick and oppressive, like a living thing pressing against his skin. He couldn't tell if he was falling or floating, as the sensation of gravity seemed to have abandoned him. All he knew was the faint sound of Julian's voice, distant and distorted, calling him deeper into the void. When he finally landed, it was with a soft thud, as though the ground itself had cushioned his fall. The air here was colder, sharper, and every breath felt like inhaling shards of ice. Elias pushed himself up, his legs trembling beneath him. He stood in a strange, desolate landscape, a place that felt both ancient and alien. The ground was covered in a thin layer of ash, and jagged rock formations jutted out at odd angles. Above him, the sky was a swirling mass of black and red, its colors shifting and pulsing like a living organism. In the distance, a faint light flickered, casting long, eerie shadows across the barren terrain. It was the only sign of life, or whatever passed for life in this forsaken place. Elias began walking toward the light, his steps hesitant and uneven. The ground beneath him shifted with every step, as though it were alive and breathing. The air was thick with an unnatural silence, broken only by the occasional distant sound. A low rumble, a faint whisper, a cry that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. As he approached the source of the light, Elias saw that it was coming from a massive structure, a towering black monolith that seemed to pulse with an inner glow. Its surface was smooth and reflective, yet it seemed to absorb the light around it rather than reflect it. Symbols and patterns etched into its surface shifted and writhed, as though alive. Standing before the monolith was Julian, or what was left of him. Julian's figure was faint and translucent, his edges shimmering like heat waves on a summer road. His eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and his expression was one of sadness and resignation. He stood motionless, staring at Elias as though he had been waiting for him all along. "Julian." Elias's voice cracked as he spoke. "What is this place? What's happening to me?" "This," Julian said, his voice echoing unnaturally, "is the place where the truth resides, the place where you buried me, and yourself." Elias shook his head, tears streaming down his face. "I didn't mean to. I didn't know. I was scared, Julian. I didn't know what to do." Julian stepped closer, his form flickering like a dying flame. "You've spent 50 years running from what you did, 50 years convincing yourself it wasn't your fault. But the truth, Elias, is that it was." Elias fell to his knees, his hands trembling. "It was an accident. I didn't mean to push you. You didn't just push me," Julian interrupted, his voice colder now. "You left me. You left me there to die. And then you buried the memory, buried me, so deep that you could pretend it never happened." The ground beneath Elias began to tremble, cracks spidering out in every direction. The monolith pulsed brighter, its patterns growing more erratic. Julian raised a hand, and the symbols on the monolith began to glow, their light searing into Elias's mind. Images flooded his vision, fragments of memory he had long suppressed. The argument in the woods, Julian's voice rising in anger, the push, the fall, and the sickening silence that followed. The sight of Julian's lifeless body at the bottom of the ravine. The panic, the fear, the decision to walk away and never look back. "No!" Elias screamed, clutching his head. "I didn't want this. I didn't mean for this to happen." "But it did," Julian said, his voice softening. "And you've carried it with you every day, even if you didn't realize it. That guilt, that emptiness, it's all been leading you here." The ground split open beneath them, revealing a chasm filled with a swirling black void. The monolith began to crack, its surface splintering like glass. Julian knelt before Elias, his glowing eyes locking onto his brother's. "You have a choice, Elias," Julian said. "You can continue to run, to hide from what you've done. Or you can face it. But know this, the truth will consume you, one way or another." Elias stared into Julian's glowing eyes, his own filled with tears. "How do I make it right? How do I fix this?" Julian reached out, placing a translucent hand on Elias's shoulder. "You can't fix it. But you can accept it. You can let it end." The cracks in the ground widened, the void below growing larger and more restless. The monolith emitted a high-pitched sound, like the wail of 1,000 voices as it began to collapse. Elias felt the pull of the void, its cold tendrils wrapping around him, drawing him closer. "Julian," Elias whispered, his voice trembling. "I'm so sorry." "I know," Julian said, his form beginning to fade. "And now, so do you." With that, Julian disappeared, his body dissolving into the air like smoke. The monolith shattered completely, its pieces falling into the chasm below. Elias felt the ground give way beneath him, and he closed his eyes as he fell into the void. The last thing he heard was Julian's voice, soft and forgiving. "It's over now, Elias. Let it go." Elias's eyes opened slowly, but he wasn't sure if he had truly awakened. He was lying on a soft surface, his body weightless, as though he were floating in the void. Above him, the swirling black and red sky had been replaced by a serene, pale blue. The silence was overwhelming, but it was no longer oppressive. It was peaceful. He sat up, his movements sluggish and dreamlike. The desolate, alien landscape was gone. Instead, he found himself in a familiar place, the clearing in the woods where he and Julian had often played as children. The trees swayed gently in the breeze, their leaves shimmering with an ethereal light. Everything was calm, but the tranquility was unnerving. Elias stood, brushing non-existent dirt off his clothes. In the center of the clearing stood a figure. Even before he saw the face, he knew who it was. "Julian," Elias whispered. Julian turned slowly, his face no longer gaunt and hollow. He looked as he had in life, young, vibrant, full of life. He smiled softly at Elias, but there was sadness in his eyes. "You made it," Julian said, his voice calm and steady. "You finally stopped running." Elias's throat tightened as he took a tentative step forward. "Is this real? Am I dead?" Julian tilted his head as though considering the question. "Does it matter? What matters is that you're here, that you face the truth." Elias closed his eyes, the weight of the past 50 years pressing down on him. "I killed you," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I pushed you, and you fell, and I left you there." "Yes," Julian said simply, "you did." Tears streamed down Elias's face as he sank to his knees. "I'm so sorry. I was angry, and I wasn't thinking. I didn't mean to." "But you did," Julian interrupted, his voice gentle but firm. "You made a choice, and for 50 years you've lived with that choice even if you tried to bury it. But now, you've faced it. That's what matters." Elias looked up at his brother, confusion etched into his features. "Does that mean I can make it right? That I can undo what I've done?" Julian shook his head. "No, Elias. What's done is done. You can't change the past, but you can let it go. You can forgive yourself." "How?" Elias asked, his voice breaking. "How do I forgive myself for what I've done to you?" Julian knelt before him, placing a hand on Elias's shoulder. The touch was warm, reassuring. "By understanding that you're human, that you made a mistake, and that I forgive you." Elias's breath caught in his throat. "You forgive me?" "I do," Julian said, his smile widening. "I've been waiting for you to forgive yourself, to let go of the guilt that's been eating away at you. That's the only way we can both be free." The clearing began to change. The trees glowed brighter, their light becoming almost blinding. The ground beneath Elias felt solid, yet weightless, as though he were standing on air. He looked around, panic flickering in his eyes. "What's happening?" he asked. "It's time," Julian said. "Time for both of us to move on. You've held on to me for so long, Elias. It's time to let go." Elias shook his head, fear gripping him. "I don't know how to. I don't know how to live without the guilt. Without you." Julian leaned closer, his expression calm and reassuring. "You'll learn, and I'll always be with you. But not like this. Not as a weight holding you back." The light grew brighter, enveloping the clearing in a warm, golden glow. Elias felt an overwhelming sense of peace wash over him, a feeling he hadn't known in decades. He looked at Julian one last time, tears streaming down his face. "Will I ever see you again?" he asked. Julian smiled. "You'll see me every time you close your eyes, every time you remember the good times we had. I'm not leaving you, Elias. I'm just letting you live." With those words, Julian began to fade, his form dissolving into the golden light. Elias reached out, but his hand passed through the air where his brother had been. The light grew warmer, surrounding him, filling him with a sense of release and acceptance. For the first time in 50 years, Elias felt free. When the light finally dimmed, Elias found himself standing at the edge of the woods near his farmhouse. The rain had stopped, and the world felt new, as though it had been washed clean. He took a deep breath, the air crisp and fresh. In his hand, he held the photograph of himself and Julian as children, the one he had found in the box beneath the tree. He looked down at it, a small smile playing on his lips. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice carrying on the breeze. Elias turned and walked back to the farmhouse, the weight of his guilt lifted. The woods behind him were quiet, but they no longer felt menacing. They felt like a part of the past he had finally made peace with. As he stepped inside, he placed the photograph on the mantel, where it caught the morning sunlight streaming through the window. And for the first time in 50 years, Elias sat in his chair and felt the world move forward.